Cold Comfort, Book 3 of the America Falls series. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr. Part 4. 19.
When the door was locked, I used the handle of the Beretta to smash the plastic swiping mechanism off the wall. No one would be letting them out any time soon. We set off at a brisk pace, Indigo and I at the front, followed by Toby and Bo, who cradled Ava between them. And then the rest of us, with Luke bringing up the rear once more. Our luck ran out when we reached the square. We were just passing the cafeteria and heading to the corner to take the left turn down to the lobby when the night patrol rounded the corner at the far end of the main corridor. We stopped dead in our tracks, as did the two soldiers. I didn't know either of these two by name, but held my hand up. I felt more than saw Luke come around our group to join me. I could tell that the approaching soldiers were wary. It was just a subtle change in the way they carried themselves. They didn't reach for their weapons, not straight away anyway. They had closed within a few feet when we heard banging and muffled yelling in the distance behind us. The two men drew their guns at the same time as Luke and I. Suddenly, we were the ones in a Mexican standoff. No matter how many times you've had a gun pointed at you, it's never a pleasant experience, not even one you can get used to. As I looked down the barrel of the weapon pointed at my face, I hoped that the young soldier in front of me was feeling it worse than me. "We have no fight with you guys," I said. "We just want to leave, nice and quiet. That's the professor and his Homeland guards back there banging. They killed our friend Sonny, and we're leaving. It's as simple as that." "Put your weapons down," ordered the soldier in front of me, with more than just a hint of uncertainty.
"Dude, didn't you hear what he just said?" Luke asked. "We're leaving, and you two aren't going to stop us. Even if you did manage to shoot one of us, and I doubt it, whoever's left will kill your buddy. If you lucked out and killed both of us, well, then there's the rest of our crew." I saw the soldier's eyes scan our group. Ben stepped forward, raising the wicked-looking knife he was holding, and then the bloody-faced Paul smiled, showing his red-stained teeth. I saw the soldier's already shaky resolve start to falter. "Listen," I said reasonably. "Our fight is not with you or Colonel Randall. This is what we're going to do. We're just going to lower our weapons and then head down to the lobby. You guys just walk on. No one will ever know. Okay?" I lowered my weapon slowly, and so did Luke. The two soldiers, still uncertain, did the same. When I was sure they weren't going to fire on us, I didn't hesitate to move. "Come on," I said, and turned the corner and walked on, the soldiers watching us go. As we picked up the pace, the sound of splintering wood in the distance behind us reached our ears. Shit, how did they get free so quickly? "Dude, I think one of them might have had that knife,"
said Luke, as if reading my mind. "Yeah, hurry." I knew that the door wouldn't hold the professor and his men much longer. We ran hard until we came to a dead stop at the final corner before the lobby. If the professor had knowledge of our escape, I knew that the Homeland guards in the lobby would also have been forewarned. There was nothing for it. We had to attack, hard and fast. Luke and Ben came forward when I gestured, and the rest of the group huddled around to listen as well. I was painfully aware of Indigo right next to me. "The three of us will go in first," I said. "No one else moves until one of us gives you the all clear. If you don't get that within 3 minutes, it means we failed and you should turn around and go back to your dormitories."
"I've got a better idea,"
said Indigo unexpectedly. She looked at Brooke.
"How about if Brooke and I go in first?"
"What?" I asked. I saw my confusion mirrored in Ben and Luke's faces.
"Think about it, Isaac. What are they going to do as soon as they see you?"
I shrugged, suddenly with a horrible understanding of where she was headed. Luke answered for me.
"They're going to shoot our asses."
"Right. Whereas if a couple of silly girls go in, they're going to let us get close." "Yeah, she's right. It's better than you lot getting shot up," said Brooke.
Ben was scornful.
"Oh, right.
And what are you going to do when you get close? Shoot them? Yes, Indigo replied, in all seriousness. Ben snorted, appalled by the idea, but I saw a thoughtful look on Luke's face. Dude, she may be onto something. They won't shoot them out of hand. If anything, it will create a fantastic distraction. No, I said adamantly. Williams is probably in there. He's too dangerous. Not to mention, I hadn't liked the way he had looked at Indigo when we had first arrived in the facility. I saw Indigo looking at Brooke and didn't miss the English girl's faint nod. Well, we're doing it, she said, in a tone that told me there would be no arguing. She stood up and grabbed the bottom of her t-shirt with one hand, and with the other reached down her top, pulling the bottom up and through the neck opening before tying it in a neat knot between her breasts. In effect, she had fashioned a kind of bikini top. A typical teenage boy, I was momentarily spellbound by the effect, that is until I saw Luke and Ben with their mouths gaping. Oh, this is silly, I snapped, standing up and pulling the gun from my belt. Indigo put her hand on mine and looked into my eyes as she moved in close. Please, Isaac, let me do this. I won't take any unnecessary risks. I held her gaze, not willing to look anywhere else unless she think me a pervert. Brooke moved up to us. Thankfully, she hadn't made any wardrobe modifications. Let us do this, Isaac, she said. It's our only chance. Deep down, you must know it. Conscious of time running out, I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Ben groaned and kicked the wall in disgust, but didn't argue any further. Luke handed me my backpack, and I pulled out 2 of the Berettas, handing one each to the girls. They both knew how to handle weapons. That wasn't what concerned me. It was just that, well, I couldn't live with myself if anything happened to either of them. The 2 girls were all business now that they had the weapons. They tucked them into the back of their pants and turned to the 3 of us. Brooke kissed Ben, and then Luke. Luke's was an innocent peck, but his pale skin blushed furiously. Indigo stepped up to me again, but this time I stopped her when she leaned in to kiss me. Are you sure you can do this? Yes. After what they did to Sonny and Ava? I released her, and she did kiss me. I hugged her and whispered, Be careful. We're counting to 20, and then following you in. She nodded and gestured to Brooke. Brooke squeezed Indigo's wrist before they stepped up to the corner. They looked at each other one last time before disappearing. I headed to the corner, gun in hand, already counting to 20. Luke and Ben sidled up, both with guns in hand, Luke still carrying his Zulu spear. Ben looked as scared as I felt, but Luke had that strange, excited look he always got before trouble. I had only counted to 14 when the first gunshot echoed from the lobby. It was quickly followed by a second and third. We pelted around the corner. The next few minutes were hectic. The first thing I saw when I ran into the lobby was a dead Homeland Security guard on the floor about 10 feet in. He was staring at the ceiling with a red bullet hole in his forehead. To my left, Brooke crouched behind a sofa, blood streaming from a nick on the bottom of her earlobe and pulling on the neck and shoulder of her t-shirt. She gave me a thumbs up even though her face was pale with shock. There was another Homeland guard draped over a table in the center of the room. It was clear that he was also dead. I had taken that much in when the first bullet whizzed over my head. I quickly ducked behind another sofa, panic setting in, not because someone was shooting at me, though. Indigo, where are you? I shouted desperately. I couldn't see her anywhere. Luke and Ben had followed me in. Ben had gone to crouch beside Brooke. He was already tending to her wound. Another shot answered my shout. It came from my left. Looking in that direction, I saw Luke hunkered down behind an upended table. He was peeking over the top with one eye, his weapon just below the rim of the table. When the Homeland guard firing at us lifted his head the next time, Luke's shot scalped him with a bloody spray and he fell with a thud. Indigo! I called again. She's over here, soldier boy. With me. Fuck. I knew that voice and felt my stomach flip. Let her go, Williams. No, I don't think so. Although I can see why you want her so bad. His attempt to goad me out of my hiding place didn't work. Luke was looking at me. He pointed to the middle of the room. That was where William's voice was coming from. behind another upended table. Fuck. How were we going to get out of this? It was Williams who ended our brief stalemate.
You know what, Isaac? I'm going to stand up with your precious Indigo in a second. My gun is going to be against her neck, just over her carotid artery. I'm then going to count down from 5. And if you and your friends don't put your weapons down and stand up with your hands in the air, by the time I get to 1, I'm going to shoot her.
I heard shuffling, and peering over the sofa, I saw him stand. Indigo was pulled hard up against him, one of his arms tight across her chest, and, as promised, his pistol against her neck.
5, 4.
I thought frantically for a way out of this mess, but there was no exit. Indigo was all that mattered right then.
3, 2.
Wait, okay, don't shoot. I stood, leaving my weapon on the floor, holding my hands in the air.
The others too.
Slowly, both Luke, Ben, and Brooke climbed to their feet, hands in the air.
Very good,
said Williams. He stepped out from behind the table, shuffling along, still holding his gun against Indigo's neck. Behind him, I saw the indicator on the elevator light up. More Homeland Security. I swallowed my bitter disappointment. Oh well, at least we had tried. The doors slid open silently.
I knew we could work this out without any more unpleasantness,
Williams said in an oily tone. I had suddenly lost interest in Williams. It wasn't more Homeland Guards in the lift. It was Meeks, and the big soldier was slowly moving towards the unsuspecting Williams, his army-issue knife in hand. I knew what I had to do. Well, we've surrendered. You got what you wanted. Now let her go, I said, attempting to keep Williams occupied.
Really, soldier boy? You're still making demands? You,
he said, pointing at Ben.
Go and get the rest of your group and bring them in here. If you're not back in 30 seconds, I'll shoot your sister in the head.
Ben didn't ask any questions. He ran out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him. That few seconds gave Meeks the time he needed to close in on his quarry. He quietly stepped up to Williams and put the knife against his throat. I was gratified by the stunned look on Williams' face, but also scared as hell he would pull the trigger.
Lower your weapon,
Meeks rasped in a no-nonsense whisper. I could almost see Williams weighing up possibilities as he frantically thought of a way out of his situation.
Not going to happen, soldier.
Yes, it is, or I'm gonna bleed you out all over this fine timber floor.
No, you're not, and you know it. You cut me, and I squeeze the trigger. Don't think I won't kill this bitch.
Now it was Meeks's turn to look uncertain, but he didn't have a chance to work something out. Indigo did it for him. With a swift movement, she reached behind her and grabbed Williams' crotch, twisting her hand violently. The muzzle of his gun slipped away from her neck as he doubled up, and Meeks seized his opportunity, grabbing Williams around the neck and ripping him backwards away from Indigo. She fell to the ground. Williams' face went red as he struggled against Meeks, attempting to bring his gun to bear on the soldier. He fired a shot over his shoulder that punched into the plaster of the ceiling, showering them with white powder and debris. Meeks grabbed Williams' gun and twisted it in his hands. We all watched, rapt at the struggle that ensued, even though I knew we should be moving while we could. At first, Williams' gun moved implacably toward Meeks's face, but in the end the soldier's superior position and the lack of oxygen from the hold he had around Williams' throat began to tell, and the gun slowly started to inch back towards the Homeland Guard's chin. It was over with a shocking bang. I guess he had a bullet with his own name on it, the soldier said quietly, as he let Williams' lifeless body fall to the floor and tucked the dead man's gun into his belt next to his own. Ben returned in another few seconds with everyone else. It only took him a second to understand what had happened.
Isaac, we have to go now. We heard lots of yelling. I think they're out of the room.
You're going out the main exit, Race? No, not me, them. I have to get to the control room and open the gate.
The girls looked confused. "What are you talking about?" asked Indigo. "I have to stay. There's no one else to open the gates. I'll try and come later." Allie grabbed my arm, but Indigo just looked hurt and confused. "You have to come with us, Isaac," the younger girl pleaded. It started a torrent, and soon everyone was talking. "Quiet!" yelled Meeks. "I'll do it." "You can't stay, Isaac. If you do, they'll shoot you on the spot. I'll open the gate. You just be ready to go." He turned and started heading towards the elevator. "Meeks, wait." I ran over to him. "How did you know to come up?" He shrugged. "I heard you talk in your sleep, then get up. I knew it was the start of your crazy plan. Anyway, I tried to get back to sleep, but I couldn't. So I thought I'd come up and check on you." I shook his hand. "Thanks. I'm glad you did. Are you sure about the gate? Randall won't be happy." "It's all right," he grinned. "Life's boring down here anyway. What difference will a few days in the brig make?" He and I both knew that his punishment would be a lot worse than a few days in the lockup, especially after killing Williams. I'm pretty sure there would be CCTV footage of the whole incident. "Go!" he yelled. "Give me about 10 minutes. Without waiting for an answer, he ran to the still-open elevator doors and was gone. We had begun picking up our gear when Toby yelled from the opening, "Someone's coming!" "Go, go, go!" I yelled. They all stopped what they were doing and ran. Ben led the way with Brooke and Indigo, the twins carrying guns. Toby and Bo were still helping Ava between them. She appeared to be awake but was very groggy. I looked around frantically but couldn't see my gun. Luke had his assegai. He saw I was without a weapon and threw me his pistol. We headed through the door. Looking to the left, I saw our group disappearing down the long passage, but behind me I heard the implacable and rapid approach of footsteps. Just one pair. I knew before we turned that it would be Rag.
"20.
He came at us. Fast. Again, I was reminded of a Terminator from the old James Cameron movies that my dad had watched with me. He ran like a machine, his movement economical and powerful. I decided not to screw around. He was too dangerous. I began to raise my gun and saw Luke in my periphery tense and start to bring his Zulu spear up. Time slowed, and it was like I was trying to raise my arm in a tub of molasses. Too slow. I squeezed off a shot, but it went over his head as he crashed into us. As a tactic, it was super effective. He hit us with such force that I think I blacked out for a second. I was vaguely aware of flying through the air, my gun dropping from my grip as I put out my hand to try and break my fall. I hit the floor, my wrist bending at an unnatural angle as I fell onto my arm. It didn't break, but the sharp pain brought tears to my eyes as I rolled onto my back, skidding along the floor like one of those MotoGP riders coming off their superbikes at 120 miles per hour. I came to a rest a few feet from the impact zone and laid there looking up at the distant white ceiling as I did a quick inventory of my body. I felt like I'd been hit by a runaway boulder, but I didn't feel any breaks. I heard groaning. "Luke." I shook off my shock and quickly scrambled to my hands and knees, not expecting the woozy feeling that came over me. My vision cleared, and I saw Luke on his belly, a bleeding graze on his forehead and cheek, reaching for his assegai, just a few scant inches from where his fingers splayed and twitched on the linoleum floor. Rag was also moving, albeit a little more slowly than he had been just a few seconds ago. He was also on his knees, and I saw him looking down at the bloody rip in the fabric of his gray suit jacket over the right side of his chest. Luke had apparently managed to stab him, but it appeared to be no more than a superficial wound. I didn't like what I saw in the man's eyes as he climbed the rest of the way to his feet. Luke was closest, and I knew he would look to deal with him first. "Watch out, Luke!" My friend must have heard something in my voice, because he suddenly came to life and lunged, his hands closing around the shaft of his spear as Rag rushed at him. I also started running, ducking to pick up the gun in a surprisingly, given my grogginess, nimble movement. I was still feet away when Luke rolled like a snake onto his back, his hand gripping the spear and bringing it to bear on Rag. It was at this point that the professor, with Bradley, Maddox, and a puffing Leroy arrived, sliding to a clumsy halt a safe distance away. I ignored them, turning my gun towards Rag for the second time in the space of a few minutes. I should have known he wouldn't just put his hands up. As I tried to zero in on him, he leapt headlong onto Luke, pushing the spear away just before impact. The weight of the man caused the breath to whoosh out of Luke as I aimed at the frenetically moving Rag. I couldn't shoot. There was no way I could take a shot without the risk of hitting my friend. Luke was no walkover and tried to wrestle his assailant off him, even as he sucked air back into his lungs. It was to no avail. Rag, while shorter than Luke, was all hard muscle and soon maneuvered himself into a position that saw them both on their side, with the professor's man lying behind Luke, his arm around his neck.
"Put the gun down."
The threat was implicit in the 4 words that the normally silent Rag uttered. If I didn't obey, he would snap Luke's neck. I was defeated. Rag knew it. The men watching knew it. I froze, unwilling to admit defeat, until Rag jerked his arm tighter and Luke's face began to turn purple. Okay, I said, holding up one hand in surrender as I bent and awkwardly placed the gun on the floor. Don't hurt him, please. Rag slowly released Luke, who began to draw deep lungs full of air. The professor's man then began to rise to his feet, his intense gaze burning into me. There was some noise from the direction of the professor and his homeland guards. I turned to look, fully aware that Rag had not released me from his death stare. Leroy had started walking towards us only to find the professor's hand on his chest. "Stay put," the older man said grimly, before looking back to Mr. Rag. "Kill him. Kill both of them." Rag stepped over Luke. Resignation washed over me, and I spread my feet, ready for my final battle. Rag took a step towards me and... His face suddenly contorted in agony. He stood straight up like he'd been electrocuted, his right arm reaching blindly behind him. Confused, I looked around him to see Luke, so recently incapacitated, rising to his own knees, concentrating as he twisted his assegai. Rag opened his mouth but didn't scream. "The gun, Isaac! Get the gun!" Luke grunted through gritted teeth, struggling to keep the flailing hand of Rag away from the spear embedded in the killer's right buttock. His desperate shout roused me from my torpor, and I bent over and picked up the gun, holding it on Rag. In my peripheral vision, I saw one of the Homeland Guards take a step forward. I turned the gun on them. I fired a shot over their heads. Unsurprisingly, it was the bully Leroy who broke ranks first. He turned and ran without another look. Maddox, clearly braver than the more recent Homeland recruit, stepped in front of the professor, while Bradley grabbed the older man's arm and attempted to lead him away. "What are you going to do, young Isaac?" yelled the professor stridently, shaking off Bradley's hand and stepping around Maddox. He held his hands out, his fingers splayed as though playing to a crowd. "Are you going to shoot me?" I pulled the trigger, giving him his answer. Why waste breath on words? The professor didn't flinch. In fact, surprisingly, he laughed. In shock, he apparently hadn't felt the bullet go through his right hand, just missing Officer Bradley's head and painting his face with blood and bone chips. It wasn't until he heard the moaning from Bradley and saw Maddox's horrified look that the older man realized he'd been shot. The effect was instantaneous. His face turned an unhealthy shade of gray, and he began to scream as he looked at his ruined hand. Maddox grabbed him again, and this time the professor allowed himself to be led away. "Come on, Luke. We need to go now," I said, turning back and warily holding my gun on Rag. Luke released the spear, but left it embedded in Rag. "Something for your ass to remember me by, you prick," he said, ruffling the man's hair as he stood and stepped around him. Apparently, Luke wasn't the only actor amongst us. As the smiling Luke took a step past Rag, the injured man's hand shot out and gripped Luke's left wrist, twisting it viciously. Luke fell to one knee in agony. I quickly stepped up and put the muzzle of my gun against Rag's forehead as Luke struggled to break his assailant's grip. "Let him go," I said.
"No, you dropped the gun."
The gall of the guy was breathtaking. He looked calm, only a light sheen of sweat on his forehead giving away his discomfort. I pressed the muzzle of the gun harder against his skull. Let him go. He didn't. What he did do was twist his hand viciously, and I heard Luke's wrist break with a horrible, meaty crack. He shrieked as Rag released him and then fell to his knees, cradling his dangling hand. I pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. I pulled it again. Click. Nothing. I saw the corners of Rag's mouth begin to curl into a smile, and in frustration I smashed the butt of the gun's handle into his right temple. His face slackened, and his glasses flew off his head as he fell sideways, his head smacking into the floor with a crack. He didn't get back up. Knowing time was our enemy now, I quickly helped Luke to his feet. He was moaning in agony. The hand he supported was rapidly turning red.
Fuck, Isaac. He broke it. The bastard broke my wrist.
I know. We have to move, though. Sorry, man. We'll look at it once we're safely out of here. Come on. I helped him up and urged him down the corridor, looking back once to check that the little bastard Rag was still down. I knew a blow to the temple like that could kill a man, but I hadn't had time to check his pulse. Like the time he climbed the mountain with a bullet wound, Luke again seemed to dig deep, and we managed a decent pace. It didn't take as much time as I thought, and we turned a corner and found ourselves in a larger chamber, a cool wind howling through the open inner and outer gates, 30 feet away. The view of the outside was underwhelming. The night was dark, inky, and I could make out nothing apart from the few feet of trail lit by the fluorescent lights of the chamber.
Isaac! Luke!
It was Ben. He ran towards us, followed by Brooke and Toby. Indigo stood where she was, looking extremely kick-ass with her t-shirt still tied up over her breasts and pointing her gun at the two guards on the floor in front of her. They had their hands behind their heads, looking extremely unhappy. Ben told me later that one had been asleep at the desk and the other one had been pleasantly taken aback at the appearance of Indigo, who had approached him the same way she had surprised Williams and the Homeland Guards. The gun in his face had soon sobered him very quickly. She really is a smiling assassin, you know? The rest of the group were around a large supply cupboard. It was to the left of the inner gate, and its contents were strewn over the floor. They were quickly donning the heavy military winter coats that were hanging neatly in a line, as if they'd been left there just for us. The chill of the night was dissipated somewhat when I saw Paul doing up the too large coat that he had helped his sister put on. As Ben and Brooke reached Luke and me, the shrill beeping of the alarm pierced the quiet of the facility. I ran over to Indigo and took the gun from her and pointed to the others. "Quickly, you should put on a coat. I'll watch these two." "Are you okay?" she yelled over the siren. I nodded. "Yeah, Luke isn't, though. His wrist is pretty bad." As if to prove my point, right then he screamed in agony as Brooke and Ben helped him into one of the coats. Indigo ran over and I called out to Bo, who was waiting for the others. "Can you bring my backpack?" We secured the two soldiers' wrists, then pushed them back to the floor. I caught the coat Ben threw me as we ran back. "We have to go now." Each beep of that alarm seemed to touch a raw nerve in my head. It was almost like a countdown, and I began to physically push those closest to me towards the gates. They soon got the message. As I went through the inner gate into the staging area, I looked up and caught sight of one of the CCTV cameras. I didn't know if Meeks was watching, but I gave the thumbs up before I turned and began running to the outer gate. Sure enough, I heard a buzz and both gates began to close. The cold of the mountain night blowing in through the outer gate cooled the sweat-soaked t-shirt I wore, and I found myself shivering, not having had the chance to put on the coat yet. The doors were closing fast when I spotted Luke's iPhone on the deck about 15 feet away. He must have dropped it. He never would have thrown it away. As prepared as I thought we had been, clearly we had not planned perfectly. The dark of the night told me one thing. We would need some sort of light. If we didn't, we would end up stopping through lack of visibility until the sun rose, huddled in the night, just waiting for the Drake Mountain people to come and pluck us off the mountain. Or worse, some of us could fall to our deaths. I looked back to the door, then made my decision. From the outside, I heard someone scream my name as I sprinted for the iPhone, scooping it up one-handed and running like a maniac for the outer gate. I wouldn't make it. I would make it. Yes, I was going to make it. I turned sideways and planted my right foot, jumping and flying through the gap. My shoulder banged hard against the 3-inch thick metal as I tumbled out and landed in a clumsy heap on the cold dirt and rock. I heard Indigo's voice nearby. "Isaac, are you all right?" "Yeah,
I'm fine. Good. Now what the hell were you thinking? I smiled at her cranky tone as I felt around for my coat. I was still holding the phone and pressed the home button to wake it up. Thank God I had charged it the day before. Turning back, I saw a shadow about my height in front of me, and I felt a sharp shot of adrenaline before I realized it was my recently acquired coat, jammed between the armored outer doors of the facility. "Oh no," said a female voice behind me. It wasn't Indigo. She was now beside me. We walked to the doors. One of the arms and most of one side of the coat dangled from where it had been trapped. I knew it was no use trying to pull it free, but I tried anyway, grabbing the arm and pulling it this way and that. I let go after a few more tugs and looked at Indigo. We didn't need to say anything. I could tell by the look in her eyes that she knew as well as I did that this wasn't good. "Isaac, I think we should go," called Ben. "Neither Luke nor Ava look too good, and we should put as much distance between us and the facility while we can." "Let's go," I said to Indigo, and we ran to the others. Ben was right about Luke. He looked miserable. His hand had ballooned to 3 times its normal size, but he still had his spear wedged under his arm. "Don't worry about me," Luke said. "Let's just make like a shepherd and get the flock out of here. I don't know if they'll just let us go or come after us, but I don't think we should hang around right outside the door too long." I patted the shoulder of his good arm and made my way to the front of our group. The night was still pitch black, the heavy cloud cover effectively blotting out the stars and moon. At least the cloud cover meant it would be a few degrees warmer than it could have been. Despite that, I knew I wouldn't make it far without a coat. Being an optimist, I put that out of my mind, and as I looked up, I briefly reflected how wonderful it was to be able to look up and not see a ceiling. I got to the front and turned around. By the inadequate glow, I could see the expectant faces looking at me, and suddenly I felt scared. I didn't feel any more equipped than the rest of them to lead us out of the valley. We were in a large, flattened area. About 20 feet to our left, the ground dropped away into blackness. "Is everybody ready? I need you all to stay as close as possible to the person in front and as near to the rock face as you can." "We're ready, Isaac," said Ben, coming to the front. He was in the process of taking off his coat. "You're going to need this, though." "No, Ben. Keep it. I'll be fine." "You won't make it in just your uniform, Isaac," said Indigo, and her voice of reason. "What about if we take turns? Every 20 minutes, someone can take a turn without a coat, except for Luke and Ava, of course. We'll need to keep their body temperatures up." Everyone agreed, and I received a few pats on the back. Their concern and camaraderie warmed me more than a jacket ever could. "Okay, great idea," I said. We set off. I went at a good pace, keeping the iPhone as far above my head as I could so that it lit as much of the surrounding terrain as possible. I didn't want to think about how much battery life it had remaining. It was at about 32% when we left, and I knew it wouldn't last long with the display on constantly. But the fact was, we needed the light. There was no point saving the battery if it meant increasing the danger of a fall for one of us. I thought about what might be happening back at the facility. They would be on high alert by now, and I knew that Leahy wouldn't just let us walk away. The only question was, who would he send after us? Randall's men or his own? Well, whoever it was, they couldn't go around us, so the narrow mountain trail gave us a good chance of holding them off with our firearms. I decided not to think too hard about it until I knew for sure that we were being chased. For now, we needed to concentrate on putting as much distance between us and them as we could. In the meantime, I told Ben, who was bringing up the rear, to be vigilant for signs of pursuit. As scary and demanding as the walk into the Drake Mountain facility had been, the walk out was worse. We had to pause several times to rest on the undulating path. It was cold and miserable, and none of us was used to vigorous physical activity, having been cooped up inside the facility for so long. Even worse than the physical aspect of our flight was the psychological one. Besides the threat of our captors pursuing us, when the path narrowed and the black chasm beside us came into full view, there was no way to tell how far one would fall if they happened to slip. It could be a few feet or 1,000. If anything,
Not being able to see anything but the inky blackness was worse than looking down on a 1,000-foot drop where you could see the bottom. As much as I concentrated on watching the path ahead, every 5 minutes or so I would bring everyone to a halt, lock the iPhone screen and look behind us, watching for the telltale sign of flashlights. Of course, they could have night vision goggles, in which case the stops were pointless, but it made me feel better. Every 20 minutes we stopped and did a coat swab, and I must say, despite my reluctance to take it when he had first offered it, after my first 20-minute stint coatless, taking that coat from Ben was the easiest thing I had ever done. After an hour of hiking, we still hadn't spotted any sign of pursuit, and I began to breathe a little easier. Perhaps the professor had decided to cut his losses and let us go. By that time, the battery was down to 5%, and, being optimistic, that would give us about 30 more minutes before it went flat. The iPhone's clock said it was 5:23. I had no idea what time dawn would break, but I knew that first light would be at least an hour and a half away. We pushed on. 20 minutes later, the battery died. Luckily, we had just gotten to a spot where the track had widened into a kind of rocky recess, the walls of the mountain towering over and around us, providing natural protection. Before the light blinked out, I saw it also had a scattering of small and large boulders, which would at least give us some shelter from the cool wind. In the almost complete darkness, I was only able to make out the barest of shapes. We all joined hands as I led the way to the back of the recess. My hand waved back and forth in front of me like I was playing blind man's bluff at a birthday party. I heard someone trip and swear behind me, and I felt a push in the back. We managed to stay upright, and after what seemed like an age, my outstretched hand brushed the rocky wall in front of me. Okay, we're at the back of the recess. Everyone sit down. You may as well try and get some sleep if you can. I'll keep watch. I heard a few more curses as everyone found their way to the ground and settled into a comfortable spot. Well, as comfortable as rocky ground could be. I thought about trying to find Indigo so that I could sit near her, but it would be pretty obvious to everyone what I was up to if I did that. I heard Allie next to me, and Paul to the right. He was comforting his sister, telling her it wouldn't be much longer now. At first, like typical teenagers, we sat with some distance between us, but as our bodies cooled, we all huddled closer together. "Are you okay, Luke?" I asked, not really sure where he was. "Yeah," he said directly from in front of me, in a voice that said pretty clearly that he wasn't fine. "My wrist hurts like a bitch, but at least I can't feel my hand." "Okay, everyone should try and get some sleep. I'll keep an eye on the path behind us for any sign of pursuit." "Don't think I can," came Brooke's voice, "but I'll give it a try." Silence fell over our little camp. I huddled with them too, but I would get up occasionally to blindly feel my way back to the trail and look back the way we had come. There were no telltale flashlight beams, and it made me feel better, even though I knew that didn't necessarily mean someone wasn't following us. It was my turn to be sans jacket, and I felt the night's chill even worse now that we had stopped moving. But at least I wouldn't fall asleep. I was way too cold for that. Famous last words.
21.
I'm not sure how long I dozed, but when I awoke with a start, the sky was kissed by the faint glow of dawn. The soft luminosity below the horizon to the east colored the low clouds a faint pink and yellow and shed enough light for me to see my fellow escapees. I cursed myself. I guessed I had been asleep for an hour or so, more than enough time for pursuit from the facility to catch up with us. I sprung to my feet and went to the edge of the recess and looked back down the path. In that soft pre-dawn light, I was able to see about 200 feet. There was no one pursuing us. Not that I could see, anyway. I looked over the edge. The path was on the edge of a steep canyon, and while it wasn't bottomless, the floor of the canyon was littered with scree and jagged rocks, and it was a long, long way down. When I got back, Indigo was looking around. Whether it was the breaking dawn, seeing Indigo, or just a feeling of well-being at escaping the facility, I felt a strange feeling of elation. "Good morning," I said, cheerily. She turned her head sharply. "Isaac? I wondered where you were. Were you awake the whole time?" Well, I didn't want to lie to her. I didn't want to admit that I had fallen asleep on my watch either. A little white lie wouldn't hurt, would it? I dozed for a minute or two, just got up when I saw the sky start to lighten. The good news is, it looks like they've decided it's too much trouble to bring us back. She came over to me, pulling off her coat. "Here, you must be freezing." I was going to protest, but as she reached me and opened the coat so I could slip my arm into the sleeve, I closed my mouth. When she was close, I sometimes forgot how to speak. She zipped up the coat like I was a little kid, and on the spur of the moment, I enveloped her in a lingering hug. I don't think I'd ever felt happier to be alive. The others in the group had started to rouse, and I heard someone groan. "Are you two at it again?" asked Ben, with a grin on his face. We laughed and disengaged, heading back over to them. Soon everyone was sitting up in various states of wakefulness. I found my backpack and pulled out the jerky I had pilfered from the storeroom. It certainly wasn't bacon and eggs, but no one refused the tough, salty offering. The canteens of water that we had were also passed around. "Shit," I said when I spied Luke's hand. I almost wished for the dark of night again. It looked like a latex glove that someone had tried to blow up like a balloon. The swelling was bad, but the color was worse. A horrible dark shade of purple. Luke looked at me and I waited for a wisecrack that didn't come. He was clearly suffering. Indigo went to him. "Is there anything we can do?" "Yeah. Cut it off." No one laughed. "I mean it. My hand needs to be cut off. My wrist is shattered. Pretty soon necrosis is going to start." "What's that?" asked Allie. "It doesn't sound good." "It's when your tissue begins to die because the blood supply is cut off." "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded and smiled grimly. "Unless you think it's a good idea to go back and knock on the door of the facility so I can get treatment." I kicked a stone in frustration, my good mood suddenly dissolving into worry for my friend. Luke knew enough about these things to know what needed to be done. "When?" "Not now. We'll need a fire." He held up one of the sharpened butter knives. "This would do it, but a longer blade would be better. And we'll need a fire or alcohol to sterilize the instrument. A fire would be best because afterwards my stump needs to be cauterized." I knew what this meant. I remembered watching an old movie called The Vikings with my dad one Saturday afternoon. A slave had his hand severed by sword as punishment. One of the onlookers had used a flaming torch to burn the end of his arm. My dad had told me it was called cauterization and was a way to seal and sterilize the man's wound at the same time. Even in the non-graphic way they showed violence in those old movies, it had made me wince when the actors shrieked in agony. To think of having to hack off Luke's hand with a knife and then somehow use fire to seal the wound made me feel sick. I felt Indigo's hand find its way into mine and squeeze. "I'll help. Don't worry." I nodded, and Luke laid back down, nursing his oversized hand against his chest. "We'll set off for the final walk to the lodge in 5 minutes. Does anyone need to go to the bathroom?" Allie put her hand up, as did Brooke. I gestured to the largest boulder in the clearing. It was to the left and closest to the wall of the canyon. "Okay. Girls over there. Boys that side." "Me first," called Paul, perhaps feeling the same happy energy that had come over me with the new morning. He shot to his feet, looking more carefree than I had ever seen him. While I hadn't forgiven him entirely for betraying us, I knew his reasons had been all about Ava's well-being. He'd only done what he had to help his sister. His close friends Bo and Toby also seemed to have forgiven him. They jumped up and began to wrestle and race him to reach the gap between another large rock and a kind of fissure in the wall that I had pointed out for the boys to use. The fissure, almost a kind of tall cave,
looked deep enough to afford anyone using it some privacy. I thought Ben might find it a little harder to forgive Paul. He watched the boys' horseplay expressionlessly. "I better go too," Indigo said, delivering a kiss to my cold cheek. Suddenly the cold seemed a whole lot warmer. Toby, the stronger of the three, pushed the other two back without too much effort, and Paul and Bo gave up, mucking around as their friend went around the rock and into the fissure. I looked at Ava. She was sitting up too and smiling at her brother's shenanigans. Apart from Luke's injury, it seemed as though we might be in pretty good shape. I was still looking at her when I saw her face change. Her mouth dropped open and she began to scream. Almost in slow motion, I turned. It was Toby. He was bent backwards at a painful angle, an arm locked around his throat, taking jerky steps towards us. Over his shoulder, I saw the grim, determined face of Mr. Ragg. Paul gave a hoarse shout of "No!" and ran to protect his sister. Bo, like me, stood in shock, as if not quite comprehending what he was seeing. Ben tried to stand but got his legs tangled in Luke's and went down in a heap. I hadn't even had a chance to move when Toby stiffened and opened his mouth to scream. I wanted to scream too, as the blade of a knife emerged from his mouth like an obscene silver tongue. His hideous, gurgling scream ended abruptly when Ragg twisted the knife and mercifully ended his torture. Several things happened then. Girls screamed. Bo rushed at Ragg, and an off-balance Ben fired his gun, the loud report sending an echo reverberating around the canyon as chips of rock exploded behind Ragg's head. Ragg, even though he was bruised and bloody, was as fast as ever. He twisted Toby's dead body around as a second shot rang out. The bullet struck the dead boy in the chest with a meaty thud, and suddenly he appeared to come to life as he rushed headlong at Ben, who struggled to rise to his feet. I was moving too now, running at Ragg even as he propelled Toby's body, one hand gripping the knife in his neck, the other on the small of his back, at Ben. Bo got there before me and hit Ragg in a heavy tackle just as the older man jerked his knife out of the spine of his victim, allowing momentum to carry the dead weight into Ben. My friend groaned as the breath whooshed out of his body and his gun spun away on the rocky floor of the clearing. I paused, standing over Ragg as Bo rained punches down on him. "Isaac!" Luke yelled. I turned, smoothly catching the knife he had thrown. I turned back and tensed. In the instant I had been distracted, Bo had been flung a few feet away, his nose bleeding, and Ragg was climbing to his feet, his rabid eyes locked onto mine, the bloody knife still gripped in his hand. He looked a nightmarish sight. He no longer wore the glasses that I had smashed from his head earlier. There was a large, bleeding welt on the right temple where I had struck him, and the eye on that side, while not closed completely, was puffy and badly bruised. He was limping, but surprisingly, the butt wound that Luke had inflicted on him with the spear had not put him out of action. I had seen the force that Luke had used, and I knew it would have incapacitated most men. Ragg was clearly not most men. I could see the crazed fire in his eyes and knew that was what had fueled him to get this far. A strange quiet fell over the clearing. I was aware of Ben struggling and swearing, trying to push the dead weight of Toby off him. Nearby, Bo was moaning, holding his head. Paul was rocking back and forth, comforting Ava and crying at the loss of his friend. I didn't dare take my eyes off my adversary, but I could hear the other girls weeping behind me. "You can take him down, Isaac." It was Luke. He spoke calmly and quietly, but without a hint of doubt in his voice. I didn't feel the same confidence. While my chances now were better than they had been 3 hours or so ago, Ragg, despite his injuries, still seemed to have more than enough strength and twisted willpower to best me, and I knew he had the skill. I relaxed and tried to slow my breathing as Ragg came to a standstill in front of me. Even though he was standing up straight, I got the impression of coiled steel ready to spring at any moment. He held the Army-issue knife in a relaxed grip by his side. I transferred the knife Luke had thrown me to my right hand. It had been sharpened so much that it resembled a long, thin dagger, and I decided right then it would be better as a puncture weapon than a cutting one. I closed my hand around it so that the blade protruded a couple of inches from the bottom of my fist. I barely had time to set myself when Rag stalked towards me. I waited until the last possible moment and then skipped backwards and to the left out of his range, making him pivot off his injured side as he followed me. He barely winced, and as I prepared to pull the same move again, he anticipated it and suddenly ran at me, bringing his knife up between us. He didn't collide with me this time. I managed to dodge to the left again as he jabbed his hand at me in 2 quick stabbing motions. The first one missed. The second one scratched my side just below my ribs. I felt a line of fire where it struck and waited for him to come after me again. He didn't. Just circled me from a safe distance. That surprised me. He'd managed to strike me and should have tried to follow it up immediately. Either he was wary of me, or more disturbingly, he wanted to draw this out. I put my left hand to the fresh wound. It was superficial only, and even though my fingers were bloody when I held them up to look, there wasn't a lot. Taking advantage of even that slight distraction, he ran at me again. Again, I was a little too slow to elude him completely, and his fist caught me above the right ear as I tried to dodge him. The blow sent me stumbling onto the hard ground, and I braced myself for impact as I scrambled desperately to my feet. Again, the expected attack didn't come. I stood up, swaying a little, as I recovered from the stunning blow and looked at him. "What are you waiting for?" I yelled, the ringing in my ear now joining the melody of pain introduced by the knife wound. Rag didn't say anything, just watched me. I think I knew what he was doing. He was trying to get inside my head. It was working. Suddenly he rushed at me again, front on. This time I was ready. Kind of. I raised the fist with the knife in it and hammered it down with all my might as he struck me in the chest with the top of his head, the full weight of his body behind the blow. I remember flying backwards and landing heavily on my back, my head ricocheting off the ground with a crack. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the clouds, winded and possibly concussed, unable to get my breath back, almost willing him to finish it. Someone was screaming, "Get up, Isaac! You got him!" Indigo's voice seemed a long way away. What was she saying? "Get up!" She seemed closer now, her voice more urgent. Was it her that inspired me to get up? I'm not sure, but I know I didn't want to let her down. I didn't want to let any of them down. As my senses came back to me, I made a supreme effort to roll over and fought my way to a crawling position. I half expected to see Rag standing over me, perhaps waiting for me to regain my feet. It was then I realized how hard he had hit me. He was also on the ground, about 6 feet away. Like me, he was on his knees as one hand reached blindly over his back, trying to grasp the knife that was embedded deep in his right lower shoulder blade, just out of the reach of his desperate fingers. He stopped trying when he noticed me. Apparently it could wait, and with implacable determination he again rose to his feet. He still held his knife, and I was now weaponless. He knew he had won. I could see it in his eyes. Very slowly, almost casually, he began to walk towards me, the knife tapping out a tune on his thigh. "No!" Indigo again. This time her voice a mix of disbelief and horror rather than encouragement. I made one last effort and pushed myself to my feet. He wasn't wary now. He was relaxed and in control. I saw my last hope in his confidence and swayed a little more drunkenly than I had to. "Run, Isaac!" screamed Indigo. Rag smiled. He was enjoying this. When he was only a few feet away, I burst to life, throwing the golf ball-sized rock I had hidden in my hand at his face. Even though I had been a decent Little League pitcher when I was a kid, the ploy was an attempt to distract him more than anything else, and I ran at him. Sometimes attack really is the best form of defense. To my utter surprise, the rock hit him
dead center of the forehead with a loud crack. He stumbled backwards like a drunk, trying to keep his feet as I hit him. We crashed heavily to the ground, and he screamed as the knife embedded in his shoulder was driven deeper by the heavy fall and my added weight. I began to rain blows upon his face, already bloody from the gushing wound the rock had made. I didn't stop until his eyes closed and he went slack under me. I sat on his chest, looking at the gray sky, my chest heaving for breath. I was exhausted and about to roll off my defeated quarry when one of his hands shot up and grabbed me by the throat, squeezing my windpipe. I only just managed to grab his other hand as he brought the knife up to finish me. We struggled, and spots began to cloud my vision. I fought to stay conscious as his knife hand slowly inched towards my eye, the point of his blade filling my quickly darkening vision. Bang! Rag's head snapped viciously to the left, blood spattering the ground beside his head. The last thing I saw as the hand around my throat slackened was Ben, his chest heaving, dropping his gun.
22.
When I came to, a circle of faces was looking down on me. Indigo was on the ground beside me, wiping my face with a damp handkerchief. Everything hurt.
He's waking up.
They helped me into a sitting position. I looked for Rag's body. It wasn't there. My eyes followed a scuffed trail that led to the cliff.
We threw him off,
Allie explained, needlessly. I nodded and looked around. Bo was resting against a rock, Ava tending to him much in the same way Indigo was looking after me. Toby's body was against the rock wall to my left. His coat had been removed and placed over his face. Brooke was busy ripping a garment of some sort into rough strips. I realized after a second that it was Rag's suit jacket. A short time later, I was patched up and feeling relatively okay, if a little cold. Luke was quiet, but managed to tell me, "Well done, dude."
Do you think he was alone then?
Ben asked. I nodded as I took a gulp of water from the canteen Allie offered me. Yeah, if he wasn't, we'd already be on our way back to the facility now, or at the bottom of the cliff. I think he thought Mr. Rag might be able to do the job.
He nearly did, but I can't believe they didn't send more after us.
I shrugged. I think the professor has more pressing matters to attend to. Like a hole in the hand.
Or maybe Randall wouldn't be a party to it. Doesn't matter. I think Leahy will try and deploy the virus as soon as he can now. He knows if the Chinese capture us, we would crack more easily than the captured soldiers might,
said Luke. Well, we can't stop him releasing the virus, but we can make sure we aren't captured by the Chinese. We need to get moving. Luke, are you okay to walk? He didn't answer, just made his way gingerly to his feet and nodded grimly. I tried to avoid looking at his hand, but it was difficult not to. We made the decision to leave the body of Toby. We couldn't bury him in the hard, rocky ground, and none of us could stomach throwing him off the cliff like Rag. We settled for leaving him where he was. We didn't have another option. Indigo went to him and took his coat, replacing it with remnants of Rag's suit jacket before coming over and handing it to me. I started to say no, but she cut me off.
He won't be needing it, Isaac.
I looked at her for a second, then nodded and took the coat. I asked Paul if he wanted to say a few words for Toby, and was surprised when he said no, his voice hitching. It was fair enough. I know what state I would have been in if it had been Luke, Ben, or any of the girls that had been killed. Even though I didn't know Toby that well, Paul, Bo, and Ava did, and I thought it was right to say a few words, so I gathered everyone around. I recited a poem I knew by a poet called Mary Fry. I knew it by heart because I had read the same poem at the funeral of my mom, dad, and sister. You could say the words were burned in my memory. We started moving not long after. The hike was much easier now that we had daylight. I had a splitting headache and started to wish that Indigo had wrapped a bandage around my skull, too. While the back of my head was not bleeding, it throbbed with a hot intensity that made it feel like my brains were leaking out. It took us another hour, but finally the path wound its way into a valley and we were able to see the lodge in the distance. It perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, a silent sentinel. I estimated it would be about another 20 minutes walking time, so I called everyone to a stop so we could have some water. No one spoke as we passed the canteen around. I think we were all too exhausted both mentally and physically from our escape and the final confrontation with Rag. We were just picking up and getting ready for the final stretch of our hike back to the lodge when Allie pointed to the sky, back in the direction we had come from, and asked with wide eyes, "What's that?" At first I didn't see what she was pointing out, and then I saw the black specks. My first thought was that it was a flock of birds or bats, but they weren't flying in quite as distinct a pattern as those creatures normally do. These ones appeared to be dispersing in all directions. I estimated there were about 100 all up. Luke joined me, then Indigo, and we stood shoulder to shoulder and watched the phenomenon in the morning sky together. "Drones," my friend whispered. "That's how he's deploying the virus." "Bastard. Why now?" Indigo asked. I shrugged. "Why not, I guess. He's probably just been waiting until they had manufactured enough, although I think our escape probably prompted him to get it out quicker. He couldn't risk us being captured and giving their position away to the Chinese." "I still don't know how he was able to make it so quickly. Doesn't it take years to make these things?" "You'd be surprised," said Luke. "When there's money or war involved, things happen almost magically fast. Look at the Ebola virus a few years ago. When it was killing poor people in Africa for 30 years, no one gave a damn. But as soon as it spread to a few different countries and it was clear that governments would pay for vaccines by the ton, they managed to produce one almost overnight. I've even heard that a cure for nearly all cancers was possible, but it was only small underfunded labs trying. The big companies wouldn't touch it because they made so much profit from all the drugs used in chemo and other medication and pain management. A cure is a one-off that would have dried up their income." "That's pretty fucked up." My eyes widened to hear those words come from Indigo's lips, but her sentiment mirrored mine. The drones flew on, heading to all points on the compass. One flew almost directly over us. It was high, but even from a distance looked like heavy-duty hardware, definitely not the kind of toy drone I used to see for sale in Walmart. "It doesn't look like there are enough to me," I said. "If it's as contagious as the professor made out, they won't need a lot. Just enough to infect a few soldiers. Then it should take care of itself." I wish there was a way we could warn Huion. "Yeah, too late now." We watched the drones until they had disappeared from sight and continued our hike. We came to the lodge 25 minutes later. We didn't waste time exploring. The place was a little bit creepy, and I don't think I was the only one who thought so. Luke collapsed when we finally broke in through a service entrance at the rear. It was as though he had used up all of his willpower to make it to the lodge and had nothing left to give. He wasn't unconscious, just plain exhausted. Ben, Bo, and myself picked him up and carried him up a flight of stairs and then into a hallway in what appeared to be the staff area of the lodge. He grabbed my arm as we walked. "You need to do it now, Isaac. If we leave it any longer, I could lose the whole arm. Or worse." I looked up at Ben, who looked a little pale at the thought. No help there. I looked back down at Luke and swallowed. "Okay, buddy, just hang in there." After a few more minutes walking, we passed a kitchen, and ahead I saw a door marked Snow Bunny Lounge. I sent the girls to look for food, but called Indigo back before she disappeared through the door. "We need the sharpest knife you can find, and some towels, even alcohol, although I doubt there'll be any left. We'll be in the lounge, trying to make a fire." "Make it 2 knives. One with a wide blade if you can find it," Luke added weakly. "Sure," she said. "See you in a minute." We walked on and pushed through the double doors into a big, unlit room. It was just as you would expect the lounge of a ski resort to be, all dark timber and leather, and right smack bang in the middle was an enormous fireplace. Thankfully, it was the real deal, and there was a stack of cut timber logs in a rack next to it. We gently placed Luke on a large, luxurious bearskin that lay on the floor in front of the hearth. I immediately went to work piling some logs and strips of an old newspaper that Bo passed me into the brazier. I surveyed my handiwork quickly when I was finished, and then began to look around for matches or something to light it with. Paul, Bo, and I searched everywhere but couldn't find anything. I was about to send them to see if they could find a supply cupboard somewhere when the girls came through the door. They were mostly empty-handed, of course. The Drake Mountain people would have stripped the place of any food and anything else they needed. Brooke did carry a pile of towels, though, and Indigo held 2 blades, one in each hand. One was a dangerous-looking wide-bladed carving knife, the other a thinner, serrated-edged one. Behind her, Allie triumphantly held up a small first-aid case. "You guys rock," I said. "Thanks. Here, watch out. They're real sharp." I took the knives from her carefully, and she immediately dug into her pocket, pulling out a box of long matches. "Thought you might need these too." Legend. Within a few minutes, we had a blazing fire and towels spread under and around Luke. The blades of both knives were in the fire. There was no alcohol in the first aid box, but the flames would sterilize the steel almost as well. Luke, for his part, appeared to be calm, although he was pale, and a slight sheen of perspiration covered his brow. I knew the answer, but I asked anyway. "You sure we have to do this? I mean, can't we?" "No, Isaac. There's no other way." I took a deep breath. "Okay, how do I do this?" "First, take the serrated knife out of the flames. That's the one you'll need to do the cutting with. Leave the other one in there. You'll be using the flat of the blade to seal the wound. It needs to be red hot. And by the way, you'll need to get the boys to hold my arm still so I don't move." I was amazed at the casual way he was speaking to us. Amazed but thankful. His relaxed attitude also had the effect of calming me. I took the serrated knife out and rested it on the towel by his side. "Now, first you need to tie a tourniquet around my arm, here below the elbow. Make it real tight." I pulled the tourniquet out of the first aid box and did as he directed. Indigo passed me a firm cushion and I placed it on the floor before lifting his injured arm up onto it. The injured hand dangled over the edge of the cushion. Lucky I hadn't eaten in a while, because when I felt the unnatural way his hand moved under my touch, I nearly threw up. Luke winced at the pain. "You girls might want to go for a walk," he managed to squeak. Indigo nodded and took Allie by the hand. Brooke and Ava followed, while the boys gathered around Luke, looks of horrible anticipation on their faces. "Do it, dude. No matter what I say or scream, don't you dare fucking stop till it's off, okay?" "Okay." I picked up the knife and nodded to Paul, Ben, and Bo. They placed their hands on Luke, and I placed my hand on his wrist about 2 inches above where I would start the cut. I'm not going to describe in gory detail what happened. Suffice to say, it was one of the most horrendous experiences of my life. I'm not sure which was worse, the sensation of the knife cutting through my friend's flesh and bone, the blood, or his screams and shrieks of absolute torture. Thankfully, by the time I placed the flat of the glowing blade against his bleeding stump, gagging at the smell of cooking meat, he had passed out. 23. In typical Luke style, he was making jokes about getting a hook within a few hours. We allowed him 2 hours to recover before eating a meal of jerky and water which we had been able to replenish from the lodge's faucets. I was still conscious of time and didn't think I would feel safe until we had put a lot more miles between us and the facility. Luke hadn't lost a lot of blood, and in fact, now that his hand was off, seemed to be almost back to his old self. The painkillers that Indigo and the girls had found on their walk might have had something to do with that, though. Even more importantly, They had also found a packet of antibiotics in the same guest room. Less than 3 hours after we had arrived, we were leaving the lodge. Luke had wanted to look for vehicles in the car park, but I overruled him, and we set off on foot. A vehicle would only make us more of a target. We had only been walking for 10 minutes when we heard the all-too-familiar rumble of helicopters coming from the direction of Lincoln. We quickly scrambled into the trees beside the road and crouched down. 5 of them went over, all heading in the direction of the lodge. We all looked at each other, and I wondered aloud if it was the smoke from the log fire that had drawn them.
"No way, dude," said Luke. "Those things were carrying about 25 troops each. If it was just the smoke, they would have sent one chopper at the most to investigate."
"He's right," Ben agreed. "I think the professor's luck may have just run out. Maybe they detected the drones?" I didn't think it was that. More likely they had finally broken the soldiers and discovered the location. Still, the facility was almost impregnable, so perhaps they were wasting their time. Just then, 2 fighter jets shot overhead. They were really low, and the sonic boom that followed caused us all to clap our hands over our heads. Less than 30 seconds later, we heard distant explosions. The target had almost certainly been the facility. "I think it's time to go," I said, trying not to think of all the people back at the facility who hadn't asked for any of the trouble that the professor had brought down upon their heads. They should be safe, even from missile strikes, in the short term. Question was, would the Chinese find a way in before the virus neutralized them? The trip down the mountain, while filled with anxiety, went relatively smoothly. We stayed in the trees as we traveled, but didn't see the ground vehicles or troops we expected might follow the air assault. By nightfall, we had made it back into Lincoln. We broke into several houses before settling on one that appeared to have been vacant before the disaster. Thankfully, we found a small selection of goods in the pantry, and the girls managed to put together a cold meal for us. We were all exhausted, so after our cold canned peas, corn, and Spam, much tastier than I remembered, we made plans for the next morning. Allie had found a tourist map of the area back at the lodge, but had forgotten about it until we began planning. It made things a lot easier. We decided we would leave at dawn and make our way down to Plymouth, then on to a small town called Moultonborough. Paul assured us that Moultonborough was nice and that we would be able to find a farm there. There were lots, and I remember it had a few lakes and, well, it was just really picturesque. Moultonborough gave me a good vibe, and I thought that its rural location, while only 23 miles out from Plymouth, meant that we would probably have little chance of running into Chinese once we managed to get off the 93. We set off after a breakfast of more Spam and a can of crushed tomatoes. Disgusting. As it was, apart from sighting a few choppers in the distance and avoiding one convoy of vehicles, we made it all the way down to Plymouth by mid-afternoon. There was a large Chinese presence in Plymouth. We could tell by the increasing number of vehicles as we got closer. We made the decision to avoid it completely and skirt the town rather than going through and trying to pick up more supplies. We stuck to the back roads, and even then, we had a close encounter with a Chinese jeep, only just managing to hide behind a hedge as it zoomed past.
"I wonder where he's going in such a hurry,"
said Luke as he dusted himself off. After the near miss, we left the road and traveled across the countryside, taking a direct route over the hilly landscape to the road that led to Moultonborough. "I think we'd better find somewhere to hole up," said Paul, about 30 minutes after we left the road. "Ava is starting to struggle, and there's still 20 miles to go." Okay. The sun was getting low in the west by that time anyway. The 175 shouldn't be too far now. As soon as we hit it, we'll find a house. An hour later, we were settled into a small cottage, and after eating another unappetizing cold meal, we bedded down, exhausted from our day's walk, as the sun set. I awoke sometime after dawn, but let everyone else sleep. There was no hurry now. I had looked at the map again and estimated we would be there in about 6 hours, even walking at a leisurely pace. We set off mid-morning. We were all excited, now that we were so close to our destination, but, for me at least, there was also an undercurrent of apprehension that something would happen to upset our plans. The sun was out that day, and the fields were green and welcoming even though winter hadn't quite finished. We stopped for a good half an hour or so when we reached a large body of water called Squam Lake. We sat down, enjoying the long-absent sunlight on our skin, sharing laughs and a few more tins of the food we had scavenged from the house. Finally, as I sat there in the grass with Indigo next to me, I began to let myself believe that we might actually be okay. 4 hours later, we topped a rise and came upon a picture book, red-painted farmhouse. It sat in a small valley upon roughly 6 open acres of softly undulating, overgrown fields, with a large pond at its lowest point. Adjacent to the farmhouse was a fenced-off paddock that had 6 or 7 cows lazily grazing. I also spotted a pig pen at the rear. I felt a sudden wave of euphoria wash over me. I wasn't the only one. With a whoop, Ben jumped in the air and ran down the hill towards the farmhouse with Brooke and Allie in hot pursuit. Ava, clearly delighted, grabbed Paul's hand and then Beau's and began skipping down the hill, laughing in delight when a worried Paul asked her to slow down. I watched them, a huge smile on my face as Indigo joined me, her hand taking mine. "We made it," she said simply. I felt another hand, this one bigger and rougher, take my other hand and looked up to see Luke gazing down at me with a romantic expression that quickly turned into a wicked grin. I shook off his big paw and gave him a punch in the shoulder of his good arm. Oh, dude, the rejection. The 3 of us laughed and set off down the hill to what would become our new home. For the first time in a long time, I dared to hope that things would work out for us, that maybe there really was a happily ever after, waiting for us there in the valley.
The end.